The scent of sun-baked pine and dry earth filled Chayton's lungs, a familiar perfume of the Dakota plains. He moved with the practiced silence of a man who had spent more years in the company of wind and rock than of his own kind. Below him, the land stretched out, a vast canvas of ochre and sagebrush, bisected by the unnatural glint of steel, or the railroad tracks, a scar of progress that pulsed with a life of its own. He was tracking a mule deer, its trail faint but clear to his eyes. But his focus was broken by a low, insistent vibration that traveled up from the soles of his moccasins, a deep thrumming in the bones of the earth. A train was coming. He lifted his gaze, his eyes scanning the horizon, where a plume of dark smoke smudged the otherwise perfect blue of the sky. The train was still miles away, but its presence was already a palpable force. It was then, as he followed the shimmering lines of the tracks, that he saw it. A small, unnatural shape, lying directly on the rails, a smudge of color that did not belong. He frowned, his hunter's instinct alerting him to something deeply wrong. It was too small for a fallen animal, too still for a person resting. Chayton unslung the old brass spyglass from his shoulder, a tool he'd taken from a cavalry officer long ago. He raised it to his eye, the metal warm from the sun, and twisted the lens into focus. The distant shape leaped into clarity, and the air left his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. It was a child. A little girl, her small body bound with rope to the wooden ties, her face turned away from him. A wave of cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over him. He could see the faded blue of her calico dress, a patch of faded color against the dark, oiled wood and gray ballast. And in that instant, the present shattered. The image of the girl on the tracks dissolved into a searing memory. Another blue dress, almost the same shade worn by his own daughter Ayanna the day the fever took her. He remembered the small, still weight of her in his arms, the life fading from her eyes like a dying ember. The grief he had carried in silence for 5 long years rose up, a physical ache in his chest, sharp and suffocating. This wasn't just a child in peril. It was a ghost from his past laid bare on an altar of steel and wood. The distant whistle of the train, a mournful cry on the wind, became a death knell. The deer was forgotten. His hunt was over. A new one had just begun. He didn't think. He reacted. He scrambled down the rocky ridge, his movement swift and sure-footed, dislodging pebbles that skittered into the silence. The earth shook more violently now, the rhythmic chug-chug-chug of the locomotive, a monstrous heartbeat growing louder with every passing second. The whistle screamed again, closer this time, a piercing shriek of warning. He ran. His legs pumped, his moccasins slapping against the hard-packed earth. The distance to the tracks seemed to stretch, the shimmering heat playing tricks on his eyes. The girl was so small, so terribly helpless. The wind tore at his long black hair, whipping it across his face. He could feel the train's power now, a physical pressure in the air. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The engine was a black behemoth, a cyclops breathing smoke and fire, devouring the distance with terrifying speed. He reached the tracks, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He fell to his knees beside the girl, his knife already in his hand. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it had stolen her voice. Tears streamed down her dust-caked cheeks, leaving clean trails through the grime. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. He saw the intricate knots of the ropes binding her wrists and ankles to the heavy ties. They were tied with a cruel, deliberate skill. "I will help you," he said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the thunderous chaos bearing down on them. He sawed at the thick rope around her wrists, the fibers parting slowly under his blade. The ground trembled so hard, the stones beside the tracks rattled. The locomotive's whistle was a continuous, deafening roar directly upon them. He could feel the heat radiating from its boiler. The first rope snapped free. He moved to her ankles, his fingers working with desperate speed. The shadow of the engine fell over them, a sudden chilling eclipse. The screech of metal on metal filled the air, as the engineer having finally seen them through the brakes. But it was a gesture of futility. A beast that size could not be tamed so quickly. The last rope gave way. Without a second's hesitation, Chayton scooped the child into his arms. Her body was rigid with shock-light as a bundle of twigs. He threw himself away from the tracks, rolling as he hit the rough ground, his body shielding hers from the impact. The train thundered past a hurricane of hot steam, shrieking steel and churning pistons. The force of its passage was a physical blow, a whirlwind that kicked up dust and stones, stinging his exposed skin. The clatter of the cars was a deafening, endless roar that seemed to go on for an eternity. And then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. The last car receded into the distance, its sound fading into the vast silence of the plains. Chayton lay on the ground, and the little girl held tightly against his chest. Her small frame was trembling uncontrollably. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind, the pounding of his own heart, and the girl's silent, shuddering sobs. He had saved her from the train. But as he looked down at the cruel rope burns on her delicate wrists, he knew that the true danger had not yet passed. He had intervened in a darkness far deeper and more complex than a simple act of cruelty. He had stepped into a story that had begun long before this moment, and he sensed with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he would be forced to see it to its end. He carried the girl towards the distant smudge on the horizon that was the town of Redemption Creek. She was ashen and mute, her eyes fixed on some middle distance he couldn't see. Her trauma was a heavy cloak, rendering her a ghost in his arms. When he entered the town's single dusty main street, heads turned. A Lakota man, a stranger carrying a white child who looked like she'd been pulled from a grave, was a sight that stopped conversations and drew suspicious stares. Redemption Creek was a town of stark contrasts. At its center stood the Kane Grand Hotel, a two-story monument of false-fronted ambition, its clean paint and gleaming glass, a testament to the wealth of its owner. Radiating from it were the real sinews of the town, a mud-choked street, a blacksmith's forge that belched black smoke, a saloon that smelled of stale beer and desperation, and small weathered homes that leaned against each other as if for support. Ignoring the whispers that followed him like flies, Chayton walked directly to the one building that promised help without judgment, the doctor's office. A simple sign, Dr. M. Albright, hung over the door. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The man who rose to greet them was older, with a fringe of white hair and kind, weary eyes behind spectacles. "Good heavens," Dr. Albright murmured, taking in the scene. He gestured to an examination table. "Put her here, son. What happened?" As Chayton gently laid the girl down, he spoke his words measured and direct. "Found her on the railroad tracks. She was tied." The doctor's face paled. He began to gently examine the girl, his touch professional and soothing. He cleaned the dirt from her face and applied a salve to the raw red rope burns on her wrists and ankles. She flinched, but made no sound. "What is your name, little one?" the doctor asked softly. The girl stared at the ceiling, her lips pressed into a thin white line. "She has not spoken," Chayton said. The door to the office burst open, and a man wearing a tarnished silver star entered. Sheriff Brody was a man caught in the middle of his life, his face a roadmap of compromise and regret. His gut strained against the buttons of his shirt, and his eyes held the perpetual weariness of someone who had long ago stopped trying to win and settled for just trying not to lose. "What's all the commotion?" He began, then stopped short, his gaze falling on Chayton, then the girl. "What in blazes is this?" Before Chayton could answer, the door opened again this time with a soft, authoritative click. The man who entered was the polar opposite of the sheriff. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed. His face was handsome, his expression one of profound paternal concern. This was Silas Kane, the owner of the Grand Hotel, the man who owned half the deeds in town and held the other half in debt. He was the architect of Redemption Creek's prosperity and its undisputed king. His eyes found the girl on the table, and he rushed forward, a flawless performance of fatherly anguish. "Eliza, my sweet girl, what has he done to you?" He reached for her, but the girl Eliza shrank away from his touch, a barely perceptible tremor shaking her body. It was a small movement, but Chayton saw it. Silas Kane didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. He turned his gaze now cold and hard as granite on Chayton. "Sheriff, ma'am." Silas said, his voice ringing with authority. "Arrest this man. This savage kidnapped my daughter." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, his hand hovering uncertainly over the butt of his pistol. "Now hold on, Silas. Let's get the story straight." "The story is simple." Silas declared, his voice rising, carrying out the open door to the small crowd that had begun to gather. "My daughter Eliza has been unwell, prone to wandering. This man found her, and instead of returning her, he took her for his own foul purposes. Look at her. He's terrified her into silence." Chayton stood still, his face an impassive mask, but inside a cold anger began to smolder. The lie was so audacious, so complete, it was almost breathtaking. He had seen the knots. He had seen the terror in the girl's eyes long before she had seen him. She was on the tracks. Chayton said, his voice quiet but cutting through Silas's performance. "Tied." Silas let out a short, dismissive laugh. "An outrageous lie. He's trying to save his own skin. Sheriff, I provide the wages that feed this town. I built the hotel that gives us a name on the map. I demand you do your duty. Protect the citizens of Redemption Creek from this outsider." The word hung in the air, thick with prejudice. Chayton could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on him, their suspicion hardening into certainty. He was the stranger. He was the Lakota. Silas Kane was the foundation of their world. The math was simple. Sheriff Brody looked from Silas's commanding glare to Chayton's unyielding calm, and then to the small, silent girl on the table. His face was a mask of conflict. Dr. Albright, still tending to Eliza's wounds, finally spoke. "The rope burns on this child's wrists are severe, Sheriff. They are deep and deliberate. This was not an accident." Silas Kane's eyes narrowed, a flicker of venom in their depths. "The man is a brute doctor. He likely tied her himself to support his twisted story. It was a masterful stroke. In one sentence, he had turned the very evidence of his crime into a weapon against his accuser." Sheriff Brody's shoulders slumped. The path of least resistance was clear. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "I'm sorry, son." The sheriff said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've got to take you into custody." Chayton's mind raced. A jail cell would be a death sentence. Silas Kane would not allow the one witness to his monstrous act to survive the night. And what would become of the girl to be returned to the man who had left her for dead unthinkable? He knew with absolute certainty that he could not allow that to happen. He had failed to protect his own daughter from the slow death of sickness. He would not fail to protect this one from the swift, brutal death her father had planned for her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Dr. Albright, a silent plea. The doctor's eyes met his, and in them Chayton saw a spark of understanding, a shared belief in the truth. As Sheriff Brody stepped forward, Chayton moved. Not with aggression, but with a fluid, explosive grace. He swept a tray of medical instruments from a nearby table, sending glass vials and steel tools clattering across the floor. The distraction gave him the split second he needed. He scooped Eliza from the examination table and burst through the back door of the doctor's office before anyone could react. He was in a narrow, muddy alley. He ran the girl held securely in one arm, her face buried in his shoulder. Shouts erupted behind him. "He's getting away, stop him!" He was now a fugitive, an accused kidnapper hunted by the very town he had sought to help. As he fled into the labyrinth of back streets and shadows, he knew this was no longer just about saving a child. It was about unmasking a devil who wore the face of a saint, and he would have to do it alone with the full weight of the law and a powerful, respected man's hatred bearing down on him. The war for Redemption Creek and for the soul of the little girl in his arms had begun. Sheriff Brody's voice, bellowing orders, echoed through the alleys of Redemption Creek. "Spread out. He can't have gone far. $100 to the man who brings him in." Chayton moved through the shadows, a ghost in the fading afternoon light. Eliza was a feather-light weight against his chest, her small hands clutching his buckskin shirt. He knew the town's layout was a trap designed to funnel everyone towards the main street. He needed to get to open country to the Badlands, where he could disappear, but with the girl that was impossible. He needed shelter. He needed an ally. He risked a glance behind him. The clumsy pursuit of armed townsfolk was easy enough to evade for now, but Silas Kane's influence was a far more dangerous weapon. He had turned public opinion with a few well-chosen lies. In this town, Chayton was already tried and convicted. He remembered the look in Dr. Albright's eyes. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble on the character of a man he'd known for less than an hour, but it was the only one he had. He doubled back, using the cover of a livery stable, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. He circled around to the rear of the doctor's practice. A small curtained window looked out over a neglected patch of weeds. He tapped gently on the glass. A moment passed, and then another. He was about to give up when the curtain was pulled back a fraction of an inch. Dr. Albright's face appeared etched with worry. He gestured towards a cellar door nearly hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown vines. Chayton slipped through the narrow opening, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him. He descended a set of rickety stairs into a small, cool space that smelled of damp earth and medicinal herbs. A single lantern cast a pool of golden light, revealing shelves lined with jars and bottles. Dr. Albright followed him down, securing the bolt on the door. "You're a fool for coming back here." He said, his voice a low whisper. "The whole town is looking for you." "And a bigger fool for letting me in," Chayton replied gently, setting Eliza down on a pile of clean burlap sacks. "Why?" The doctor sighed, polishing his spectacles on his coat. "Because I've been this town's physician for 20 years. I've set Silas Kane's broken arm, treated his winter coughs, and delivered his daughter." He paused, his gaze falling on the silent girl. "I also treated his wife Martha for the bruises she tried to hide. She claimed she was clumsy. I never believed her." A piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The respectable Silas Kane was not the man he appeared to be, not even in the privacy of his own home. "He'll have men watching your office," Chayton stated. "Let them watch," the doctor said with a flash of defiance. "They'll be watching the front. No one's used this cellar entrance in years." He handed Chayton a canteen of water and a small loaf of bread. "You can stay here until nightfall. After that, you're on your own. It's all I can do." "It is enough," Chayton said. "Thank you." For the next few hours, the cellar was their sanctuary. Eliza, exhausted by her ordeal, curled up on the sacks and fell into a troubled sleep, her small body twitching with unseen nightmares. Chayton sat watch, his senses on high alert. He could hear the muffled sounds from the street above, the tramp of boots and the angry shouts of the search party. He was a wolf in a cage, a hunter being hunted. He knew he couldn't simply run. To flee would be to admit guilt and leave Eliza's fate in the hands of a monster. He had to prove his innocence, which meant proving Silas Kane's guilt. But how it was his word, the word of a Lakota drifter, against the word of the most powerful man in the territory. He needed more than the truth. He needed proof. As darkness fell, Dr. Albright returned. "They've called off the search for the night," he whispered. "But Kane has hired a pair of bounty hunters, the Miller brothers, vicious men. They'll pick up your trail at first light." "I need to know more about Kane," Chayton said. "About his wife. You said she died." "Years ago," the doctor confirmed. "Official story was a fire at their homestead out east of here before he built the hotel. A terrible accident. He was inconsolable. It was shortly after that he began buying up land, investing in the railroad. Some said the grief drove him to build a new life, to erase the old one. A fire. An accident." Chayton's instincts told him it was no accident. "Where was this homestead?" "About 10 miles east, near Rattlesnake Canyon. Nothing left but a stone chimney now. But be careful, Chayton. Digging into Silas Kane's past is like disturbing a nest of hornets." Armed with this new information, Chayton knew what he had to do. He gently woke Eliza. "It is time to go," he said softly. The girl's eyes fluttered open, still clouded with fear. He offered her a piece of the bread, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, nibbling at it like a frightened mouse. It was the first thing she had eaten. Dr. Albright led them out of the cellar. The night was cool, the sky a vast, dark ocean littered with indifferent stars. "Head north into the Badlands," the doctor advised. "There are caves, places to hide. I'll do what I can from here, try to reason with Brody." "Brody listens to power, not reason," Chayton said. "Stay safe, Doctor." With a final nod of gratitude, Chayton lifted Eliza into his arms and melted into the darkness. He moved through the night with an unnerving silence, his path taking them away from the town and into the rugged, broken country to the north. The landscape was a maze of shadowed canyons and stark, moonlit mesas, a place that would be a death trap for the uninitiated, but was a sanctuary for him. He found a small, defensible cave tucked into the side of a bluff, its entrance concealed by a curtain of ancient junipers. From here, he had a clear view of the surrounding terrain. He built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the cave, its warmth pushing back the chill of the night. Eliza huddled close to the flames, wrapped in a spare blanket Dr. Albright had given them. For the first time, she looked directly at him, her gaze filled not with terror, but with a dawning curiosity. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a tiny rusty sound from disuse. "Why did I help you?" Chayton asked gently. She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her small shoulders. Chayton looked into the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. He thought of Ayanna, of the promise he had made to her spirit to live a life of honor. "Because no child should know the fear I saw in your eyes," he said simply. "My own daughter? She was taken by sickness. I could not fight it. But I can fight this." He didn't know if she understood, but a flicker of something, perhaps trust, ignited in her gaze. She held out the last piece of her bread to him. He broke it in two, and they shared it in silence, two lonely fugitives in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The next morning, as the sun's first rays painted the eastern sky in shades of blood orange and rose, Chayton was already awake, perched on a rock high above their hiding place. He scanned the plains with his spyglass. It didn't take long to find them. Two riders moving with grim purpose, their rifles glinting in the morning light. The Miller brothers. The hunt had resumed. Chayton knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. He needed to get to the ruins of the old Kane homestead. He needed answers. And he would have to outrun and outwit two of the most ruthless trackers in the territory to find them. The chase through the Badlands had begun, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across a landscape of stone and shadow. With every step, he was moving not just further from his pursuers, but deeper into the dark heart of Silas Kane's past. The Miller brothers were relentless. They moved like wolves, patient and efficient, their eyes missing nothing. Chayton, burdened with Eliza, could not move as fast or as freely as he normally would. He was forced to use every ounce of his skill, every trick of the land he had ever learned to stay one step ahead. He laid false trails, used rocky ground where he would leave no tracks, moved only when the shifting shadows offered the most cover. Eliza, though still mostly silent, proved to be a resilient companion. She did not complain about the rough terrain or the constant hurried pace. She seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, her small hand often finding his for reassurance. During their brief rests, Chayton would point out things to her, the way a hawk circled on the thermal winds the name of a desert flower, pushing its way through a crack in the rock. He was trying to replace the terror in her mind with the quiet wonder of the natural world, to show her that not everything in it was a threat. After 2 days of tense travel and near misses, they finally reached the area Dr. Albright had described. The ruins of the Kane homestead stood on a desolate, wind-scoured patch of land. All that remained was a blackened stone chimney rising from the earth like a tombstone. The ground was littered with charred timbers and the ghost of a foundation. Chayton concealed Eliza in a rocky crevice with a clear view of the site, giving her the canteen and a stern warning not to move or make a sound. "I will be back before the sun touches that peak," he promised, pointing to a distant butte. He approached the ruins with caution, circling them twice to check for any signs of a trap. Seeing none, he moved into the foundation's footprint. The air felt heavy here, thick with a lingering sorrow. He sifted through the debris, looking for anything the fire might have spared. Most of it was just ash and fused glass. But then, near the base of the chimney, his fingers brushed against something solid beneath the soil. He dug carefully and unearthed a small, fire-blackened metal box. It was rusted shut. Using the hilt of his knife, he pried the lid open. Inside, protected from the worst of the flames, were a few singed documents and a small leather-bound journal. The documents were old land deeds, but the journal was what held his attention. The handwriting was delicate feminine. It had to be Martha Kane's. He opened it. Many of the pages were burned or water-damaged, the ink bled into illegibility. But he was able to piece together fragments. Entries spoke of a loving husband who grew distant, obsessed with his land. Then the tone shifted, growing fearful. Words like rage, dark moods, and unreasonable appeared. One entry was chillingly clear. "Silas says the railroad is a serpent that will poison this land. He speaks of sacrifice to appease the changing world. His eyes, when he says it, they frighten me." Sacrifice. The word echoed in Chayton's mind. It was not progress Silas Kane hated. It was something more personal, more twisted. As he was about to read, on the sharp crack of a rifle split the air. A chip of stone exploded from the chimney, inches from his head. The Miller brothers, They had found him. Chayton dove behind the chimney, the journal clutched in his hand. Another shot rang out, thudding into the stone where he had been. He was pinned down. He peered around the edge of the chimney. The two brothers were advancing, one moving to flank him from the left, the other from the right, using the sparse cover of rocks and sagebrush. He had only his bow and a handful of arrows. A rifle was a far superior weapon in this open terrain. He knew he couldn't win a direct fight. His only concern was for Eliza. He had to draw them away from her hiding place. He waited until the brother on the left was momentarily exposed as he moved between boulders. Chayton rose, drew, and loosed an arrow in one fluid motion. The shot was a gamble fired at a long distance. It struck the bounty hunter in the thigh, causing him to cry out and stumble to the ground. The second brother immediately opened fire, forcing Chayton back into cover. But the distraction had worked. The wounded man was a liability, their coordinated attack broken. Seizing the opportunity, Chayton broke from cover and ran not towards Eliza, but in the opposite direction, towards the treacherous terrain of Rattlesnake Canyon. "He's running," the uninjured brother shouted. "You stay put, I'll finish this." Chayton scrambled over rocks and through thorny brush, the bounty hunter's bullets kicking up dust around his feet. He led him deeper into the canyon, a place of narrow passages and steep drops. It was a landscape he understood. Here, a rifle was less of an advantage. Here, silence and cunning were the true weapons. He found a narrow fissure in the canyon wall and slipped inside, pressing his body against the cool rock. He controlled his breathing, listening. He heard the bounty hunter approaching, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, his curses echoing off the stone walls. "Come on out, Indian Cane's paying good money for you, dead or alive. Dead is easier for me." The bounty hunter passed his hiding spot. Chayton emerged behind him, as silent as a shadow. Before the man could turn, Chayton struck, knocking the rifle from his hands. The fight was brutal and short. In the end, the bounty hunter lay unconscious, bound securely with his own rope. Chayton took the man's rifle and ammunition belt. He found the other brother tending to his arrow wound and disarmed him as well, leaving them both tied up and their horses scattered. They would live, but they would not be a threat for a long time. He returned to Eliza as the sun touched the peak he had indicated. She was safe. She ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his legs in a gesture of pure relief. That night, by the light of a small fire, he read more from the journal. And then he found the entry that changed everything. An army patrol came by today. Their scout, he was a Lakota man. He had sad, kind eyes. He pointed them west away from us, and for that I was grateful. But Silas saw him. He has been ranting for hours. He called the scout a traitor to his own blood, guiding the very men who would destroy us. He sees the railroad, the army, the scout, all as one and the same. A personal blight upon his life. Chayton's blood ran cold. A Lakota scout. Sad, kind eyes. A fragmented memory, a ghost from his past surfaced. A young man barely 20 working for the U.S. Army, guiding patrols through territory he knew better than they did. He had done it for money, to feed his family, telling himself he was keeping the peace, steering the soldiers away from his people's sacred sites. He remembered a small homestead, a woman who had given him a cool drink of water, a man who had watched him from the porch with eyes full of burning hatred. He had been that scout. The full, monstrous truth crashed down upon him. Silas Cane's vendetta was not about a chance encounter. It had been simmering for years. Silas believed Chayton was the catalyst for his ruin. But the journal still didn't explain the fire or what happened to Martha. He knew he had to confront Silas. He had to force the final piece of the puzzle from the man himself. He was no longer just a protector. He was a central actor in this tragedy, a ghost from Silas Cain's past, returned to haunt him. Armed with this devastating knowledge, he planned his return to Redemption Creek. He sent Eliza ahead with a note for Dr. Albright, instructing her to use the secret cellar entrance. He taught her the route, making her repeat it until she knew it by heart. It was a terrible risk, but leaving her in the wilderness was no longer an option, and he could not face Silas with her at his side. He watched her go, a small, brave figure disappearing into the twilight before he turned his own face towards the town. He entered Redemption Creek under the cover of a moonless night, using the bounty hunter's rifle as his only companion. He moved directly towards the Cain Grand Hotel, a dark monolith against the starry sky. He found Silas Cain alone on the balcony of his presidential suite, staring out at the town he owned. "Cain," Chayton said, his voice low and steady from the shadows of the street below. Silas started peering into the darkness. "Who's there?" "The scout," Chayton said, stepping into the dim light of a street lamp. "The one you never forget." Recognition followed by pure, unadulterated hatred flooded Silas's face. "You," he hissed. "I should have known you wouldn't be easy to kill. You tied your own daughter to the tracks, Cain. You tried to murder her. Why?" Silas laughed, a chilling, mirthless sound that echoed in the empty street. "You think I wanted to save her? That track, that engine. It was an altar, a sacrifice to the great God of progress that you and your blue-coated masters brought to my doorstep. The very beast that took everything from me." "You're insane." Chayton breathed, the scope of the man's madness finally becoming clear. "Am I?" Silas leaned forward, his knuckles white on the railing. "My wife Martha, she saw the world changing. She wanted to sell the land, move to the city. She wanted to embrace the serpent. I tried to make her see the poison, but she wouldn't listen. The fire, it was a cleansing. An accident, of course. A terrible, tragic accident." His eyes gleamed with a fanatic's light. "But it wasn't enough. The serpent was still there, its steel spine cutting through my land. And then, after all these years, fate delivered you back to me. The beginning of all my pain. I realized then what I had to do. A sacrifice of my own blood, my daughter, upon the altar of the railroad. An offering so profound that the world would have to take notice of my suffering. His war wasn't for his daughter, it was against Chayton. Eliza was just a pawn, a symbol to be destroyed. And you would have let her die just to make a point?" Chayton asked, his voice shaking with a rage he could barely control. "It would have been a beautiful, tragic legend," Silas sneered. "The innocent daughter of the town's founder, struck down by the railroad he helped to build. A martyr. And you, her savage kidnapper, would have been hunted down and hanged for it. It was a perfect plan. You ruined it." The midpoint had been reached. The mask was gone, revealing the monster beneath. Chayton now understood the full depth of Silas's depravity. This was not a man who could be reasoned with or brought to justice by ordinary means. As they stood locked in a silent war of wills across the empty street, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the first grains of dust. A low rumble, not of a train, but of thunder, sounded in the distance. The sky was turning a sickly yellow gray. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the tempest that was about to break over Redemption Creek. Knowing his secret was out, Silas Cain abandoned all pretense of civilization. His plan had been exposed, his grand, twisted narrative shattered. All that remained was raw, desperate power. From his hotel balcony, he began to shout, his voice carrying on the rising wind. "He's here. The kidnapper is in the street. He's come back to harm my child." Lights began to flicker on in windows. Doors opened. Men drawn by the alarm and the promise of bounty money emerged with rifles in their hands. They were not lawmen. They were Silas's employees, his debtors' men whose loyalty was bought and paid for. They formed a loose cordon, their faces grim in the flickering lamplight. Chayton faded back into the shadows. He had what he needed, the confession, but it was worthless without a witness. He had to get to Sheriff Brody, to Dr. Albright. He had to get back to Eliza. He found the doctor's office dark. He used the cellar entrance, his heart pounding. The cellar was empty. A note lay on the burlap sacks where Eliza had slept. It was in the doctor's hurried script. Kane's men took her. They have me too. He's holding us at the hotel. It's a trap, Chayton. Don't come. The words were a punch to the gut. Silas had anticipated his every move. He had taken the last two people in this town who knew the truth, and he had taken the one person Chayton had sworn to protect. The trap was set. Silas knew he would come. As Chayton emerged from the cellar, the storm hit. It was not a rainstorm, but a black roller, a terrifying phenomenon of the plains. A solid wall of dust, thousands of feet high, descended upon Redemption Creek, plunging the world into a howling, suffocating darkness. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at signs and shutters. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world shrank to a maelstrom of grit and noise. The storm that had been a metaphor was now a reality, isolating the town, trapping predator and prey together in a violent claustrophobic cage. The townsfolk scrambled for shelter, leaving the streets to the wind and to Silas Kane's gunmen, who moved like phantoms in the gale. Chayton tied a bandana over his nose and mouth, the rifle held tight against his chest. He had to get to the hotel. It was a fortress, its windows filled with armed men. A direct assault was suicide. He remembered the layout of the town and the network of back alleys and rooftops he had learned as a boy. He climbed onto the roof of the livery stable, the wind trying to tear him from his perch. He moved across the rooftops, a shadowy figure against the swirling brown sky. The dust was a living thing, stinging his eyes, filling his lungs. Below he could see Kane's men, their lanterns casting feeble dancing circles of light in the gloom. They were searching for him, but they were looking on the ground. He reached the roof of the building adjacent to the Kane Grand Hotel. A narrow gap, a chasm of howling wind and darkness separated them. He took a running start and leaped, landing hard on the hotel's flat roof, the impact jarring his bones. He found a service hatch and forced it open, dropping into a top-floor storage room. The hotel was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the roar of the storm outside and the creak of the building's timbers as they strained against the wind. He moved down the hallway, the thick carpet muffling his footsteps. He knew where Silas would be, his office, the seat of his power, the heart of his empire. He reached the heavy oak door and listened. He could hear voices inside, Silas's sharp and angry, and the doctor's calm and defiant. He could not hear Eliza. He kicked the door open. The scene inside was lit by a single flickering oil lamp that threw long, monstrous shadows across the walls. The room was the height of frontier luxury, a massive mahogany desk, leather-bound books, a plush carpet. Dr. Albright was tied to a chair. Across the room, backed against a large window that rattled violently with each gust of wind, stood Silas Kane. He held Eliza in front of him, a pistol pressed to her small head. "I knew you would come." Silas said, his face a mask of triumphant madness. The brave hero coming to save the damsel. How predictable. The only other sound in the room was the loud, relentless ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow counting down the final seconds. "Let them go, Kane," Chayton said, raising his rifle. "It's over." Over. Silas laughed a dry, rasping sound. It's just beginning. You still don't understand, do you? You don't know why this is all happening. I was the scout, Chayton said, his voice flat. Your wife wrote about me in her journal. You hated me for guiding the army. That's only half the story. Silas sneered, his eyes glittering with a terrible fire. You think you just led a patrol past my homestead. That day, after you took your drink of water and went on your way, the patrol you were guiding circled back. They said they were looking for renegades. They burned my crops. They terrified my wife. They were the ones who started the fire in my soul, a fire that would not be quenched. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. But that's not the worst of it. Silas continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. A week later, another patrol came. They weren't lost. They knew exactly where to find my land. They had a map you had drawn for their commander. You didn't just lead them past my home, you fool. You put it on their map. You marked my land, my life for destruction. My wife, Martha. She tried to fight them when they came for our livestock. There was a struggle. She fell and hit her head on the stone hearth. They rode off and left her there to die. I found her when I came back from town. You didn't just take my future. You took my wife. The revelation struck Chayton with the force of a physical blow. The fragmented memories slammed together into a coherent, horrifying picture. The maps he had drawn, the routes he had marked, thinking he was doing the lesser of two evils. He had been so young, so naive. He had been a tool, and his actions had led directly to this man's tragedy. The guilt he had carried for years, a shapeless, nameless burden, now had a face and a name: Martha Kane. You took my family. Silas screamed, his voice cracking with years of repressed grief and rage. So, I'm erasing yours from this world, an eye for an eye, a daughter for a wife. In that moment, Chayton's fight ceased to be about justice. It was about atonement. He had to save this child, not just from her father, but from the consequences of his own past. As Silas ranted, his grip on Eliza loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all Chayton needed. He fired the rifle not at Silas, but at the grandfather clock. The clock exploded in a shower of wood and gears, the sudden deafening noise a thunderclap inside the room. Silas flinched, startled. Eliza, acting on pure instinct, bit his hand hard. He cried out in pain, his grip failing. Eliza scrambled away, running towards Dr. Albright. Silas raised his pistol, his face contorted with fury, and fired at the fleeing child. Chayton threw himself in front of her, the bullet tearing through the flesh of his shoulder, the impact spinning him around. He staggered, but did not fall. Through the searing pain, he charged. He crashed into Silas, and the two men went tumbling through the large window. The glass shattered, and they were thrown out into the raging heart of the storm. They landed on the balcony, the wind and dust, a blinding, deafening vortex. The fight was primal, a desperate struggle on a precipice. They were no longer a scout and a landowner. They were two men defined by a single shared tragedy. Silas was fueled by years of hate, Chayton by a lifetime of regret. They grappled, trading blows that were half lost to the force of the gale. Below them, the street was a swirling river of dust. Chayton saw Sheriff Brody and a few townsmen, their faces turned up in horror, drawn by the sound of the gunshot and the shattering glass. Brody raised his pistol, but the wind was too strong, the combatants too entangled for a clear shot. Silas drew a concealed knife, its blade gleaming, even in the murky light. He lunged. Chayton deflected the blow, the blade slicing his arm. He grabbed Silas's wrist, their faces inches apart, their eyes locked in a final, terrible understanding. This ends now? Chayton gasped, his blood hot on his skin. With a final desperate surge of strength, he twisted Silas's arm, using the man's own momentum against him. Silas stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, as he lost his footing on the edge of the balcony. For a heartbeat, he hung there, suspended between the hotel and the storm. Then, with a scream that was swallowed by the wind, he fell into the howling darkness below. Chayton collapsed onto the balcony, his body screaming in protest, the storm raging around him as if trying to wash away the sins of them both. The climax was over. The reckoning was complete. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the thick brown dust began to settle, revealing a world remade. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the haze, illuminating a town coated in a fine layer of red earth, as if the land itself had wept over it. Inside the ruined office, Sheriff Brody was cutting Dr. Albright free. The doctor immediately rushed to Chayton's side, tearing strips from his own shirt to staunch the bleeding from the gunshot wound in his shoulder. Eliza huddled near them, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on Chayton. Brody walked to the edge of the broken window and looked down into the street. A small, silent crowd had gathered around the still form of Silas Kane. The sheriff turned back, his face aged and weary. He looked at Chayton not as a fugitive, but as the man who had done what he could not. "I failed this town." Brody said, his voice quiet. He unpinned the silver star from his chest and held it out. "I don't deserve this." Chayton, leaning heavily on the doctor, shook his head. "Pick it up, Sheriff," he said, his voice strained, "and earn it back. The town needs a lawman, not a ghost." Brody looked at the star in his hand and then back at Chayton. He gave a slow, deliberate nod and pinned it back on his shirt. An unspoken understanding passed between them. The old order was gone. A new, more honest one had a chance to be born from the dust. Later, in the quiet, clean space of the doctor's office, Dr. Albright stitched Chayton's wounds. The physical pain was a dull throb, a distant echo of the deeper ache in his soul. Eliza sat on a stool beside him, never taking her eyes off him. When the doctor was finished, she reached out a small, hesitant hand and gently touched the bandage on his shoulder. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "Some things hurt more," he answered, meeting her gaze. He saw his own past, his own guilt reflected there. But he also saw a glimmer of hope, of a future that was not yet written. They were two broken pieces of a shattered world, but here in this quiet room, they were beginning to fit together. The town of Redemption Creek had a long road to healing ahead, but for the first time in a very long time, so did he. Months passed. The seasons turned. The dust of that terrible storm had long since been swept away, but its memory lingered, a permanent part of the town's history. Redemption Creek was quieter now, more sober. The Kane Grand Hotel was under new management, its opulence a hollow reminder of the man who built it. The legend of the Lakota hunter and the corrupt town father had, as promised, spread across the territory, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and in saloons. Chayton had stayed. The wandering spirit that had driven him for so many years was finally at peace. He no longer felt the need to run from the ghosts of his past. He had found a job at the livery stable, the simple, honest work of tending to horses grounding him. The townsfolk, once so quick to judge him, now treated him with a quiet respect. He was no longer the outsider. He was their protector, a man who had shown them the truth at a great personal cost. He had become a guardian in another, more important way. He and Eliza now lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, with Dr. Albright as their frequent and welcome guest. Under Chayton's patient care, Eliza had slowly begun to heal. The silence that had once imprisoned her gave way to questions, then to stories, and finally to laughter. She followed Chayton everywhere, a small bright shadow, learning the names of the constellations from him at night and the ways of the prairie animals by day. One crisp autumn afternoon, when the cottonwood trees along the creek were blazing gold, Chayton took Eliza by the hand. He carried a small object wrapped in a piece of buckskin. They walked to the town's small cemetery, a quiet place on a hill overlooking the plains. They stopped before a new headstone, simple and clean, that he had paid for himself. It read, "Martha Kane, beloved mother." Eliza stood silently, her expression somber. Chayton knelt and unwrapped the object he was carrying. It was a small wooden bird, a meadowlark, carved with intricate detail from a piece of pale cottonwood root. Its head was cocked, as if in mid-song. He had carved one just like it long ago for his own daughter, Ayanna. It was the last gift he had ever given her. He gently placed the wooden bird at the base of the headstone. The act was a confluence of past and future, of grief and hope. It was a tribute to the woman whose death had set so much in motion, an apology for the part he had played in her fate, and a promise to the daughter she had left behind. He was not replacing his lost daughter, but honoring her memory by building a new future, by protecting the life she never got to live. He was forgiving Silas, and in doing so, he was finally forgiving himself. Eliza watched him, her eyes full of a wisdom beyond her years. She reached out and placed her small hand over his on the cool stone of the grave. They stayed there for a long moment, a silent vigil of remembrance and release. Then together, they turned and walked back toward the town. The setting sun cast their long shadows before them. Two figures, no longer a broken man and a rescued girl, but a new family walking hand in hand towards home.